License and registration now! Hands on the steering wheel!
Officer, I'm complying! What is happening? Why am I stopped?
Out of the car! Hands where I can see them! Move!
I'm cooperating! Please tell me what I did! I haven't done anything!
Armed robbery suspect reported! You match the description exactly!
On a Tuesday afternoon in suburban Ohio, a traffic stop began like thousands of others. A police officer activated his lights. A black driver pulled over. But what happened next would dismantle a career, expose systemic failures, and raise questions about power, accountability, and justice that still echo today. This is the story of Officer Mark Peterson, the man he pulled over, and how one moment of profound injustice led to real consequences. Before we get started, where are you tuning in from? Drop your country or state in the comments. And hey, if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, now's the time, because what's about to happen next will leave you speechless, and you won't want to miss stories like this. Before we get to the stop itself, we need to understand who Officer Mark Peterson was. For 15 years, he served with the Riverside Police Department in a mid-sized Ohio city. On paper, he was exemplary, decorated, promoted to sergeant, respected by his peers. But outside the precinct, Peterson had a reputation that wasn't documented in any official file. In certain communities, particularly the black community, Peterson was known for aggressive stops, known for escalation, known for searches that seemed targeted. Community members had complained before, but complaints against officers rarely gain traction without the right documentation or media attention. Peterson operated in a system that historically protected him. He worked for a department with minimal accountability mechanisms, a union contract that made termination nearly impossible. And most importantly, he pulled over people who often didn't have the resources to fight back legally. But on this particular day, Peterson would pull over the wrong man. David Mitchell wasn't a stranger to the world of law. He was a civil rights attorney with 12 years of experience and a reputation for meticulously documenting police misconduct. Mitchell was successful, respected, and critically, he knew his rights. On that Tuesday, Mitchell was driving his 2018 Audi sedan, returning from a court appearance downtown. It was 3:15 p.m. He was driving at 34 miles per hour in a 35 zone. He wasn't speeding, he wasn't swerving, he wasn't committing any traffic violation. Mitchell noticed the patrol car a few blocks back, matching his speed. He wasn't alarmed, at least not initially. But when the lights activated, he felt that familiar tension, the tension that millions of black Americans know intimately. He pulled over immediately, hands on the wheel, license ready. He knew the protocol. Officer Peterson approached, hand on his service weapon. License and registration, Peterson said, his tone already aggressive. Mitchell complied calmly. "Officer, I'm just wondering, what was the reason for the stop?" Peterson's response, "You'll find out. License now." That command, that refusal to explain the reason for the stop, should have been the first red flag. What happened next,
Vehicle. Step out of the car. Why am I being asked to step out? Mitchell asked, remaining calm but questioning. He knew that officers can ask drivers to exit vehicles, but the reasoning matters legally and practically. "Now," Peterson commanded, opening the door. Mitchell exited. Peterson immediately frisked him, a pat-down search. Mitchell was wearing a suit jacket and slacks. He had no bulges, no weapons, nothing that would justify a search. "You're nervous," Peterson said, his voice carrying accusation. "I'm confused," Mitchell replied. "I'd like to know why I was stopped." Peterson didn't answer. Instead, he said, "We've been getting reports of a suspect in the area matching your description. Armed robbery, early this morning." But here's what Peterson didn't know. David Mitchell had been in court, on record, with witnesses, during the exact time the robbery occurred. Mitchell had receipts, timestamps, and a public record proving his alibi. "I can show you my calendar. I was in federal court this morning. Public record." Peterson waved him off. "I need you to step to the back of the vehicle." What happened next was the moment everything changed. Peterson claimed Mitchell was acting suspicious and failing to comply. He claimed Mitchell reached for his waistband. He claimed he felt threatened. None of this was true, but it's what Peterson stated in his report. Mitchell was slammed against the vehicle, handcuffed, and arrested for assaulting a police officer and resisting arrest. The irony was stunning. The one person in that interaction who actually had detailed knowledge of how to fight this in court had just been silenced by that very system. Normally, at this point, the system would protect Peterson. A man without legal training would be overwhelmed. Without resources, he might accept a plea deal. Without a platform, his voice would disappear into the machinery of the criminal justice system. But Mitchell wasn't that man. Within hours, Mitchell contacted a colleague. He had video evidence. He had his court record. He had his alibi. And he had something most people don't have: credibility within the legal system itself. His bail was set at $500, a pittance and deliberately insulting. He was released the same day. The story might have ended there, with Mitchell as yet another statistic. But it didn't, for one critical reason. Mitchell began documenting everything. He filed a FOIA request for all police records related to the stop. He obtained the dashcam footage, which completely contradicted Peterson's narrative. He subpoenaed the court records proving his presence downtown during the alleged robbery. He hired a use-of-force expert to analyze the body cam footage. Mitchell's case was airtight, not just legally, morally. The Riverside Police Department initially circled the wagons around Peterson. The Police Benevolent Association assigned him a lawyer. The department's Internal Affairs Division, which had been notoriously reluctant to find officers at fault in the past, began a perfunctory investigation. But then, the story leaked. A local journalist, having connections with the civil rights community, learned about Mitchell's case. The journalist investigated. When she discovered that Mitchell was a civil rights attorney and that the evidence against Peterson was devastating, she ran the story. Her headline read, "Civil rights attorney arrested by police officer in apparent case of mistaken identity and possible retaliation." The story went viral locally, then regionally, then nationally. News outlets picked it up. Social media exploded. And suddenly, the pressure wasn't coming from inside the system. It was coming from outside. Impossible to ignore.
The state attorney general's office took over the case from local prosecutors. An independent investigation was launched. The district attorney announced that the charges against Mitchell would be dismissed immediately. But the investigation into Peterson was just beginning. What investigators discovered was damning. Peterson's personnel file contained previous complaints, 7 of them dating back 9 years, several from black drivers, all dismissed or unresolved. One complaint in particular stood out. A woman alleged that Peterson stopped her without cause and became verbally abusive when she questioned the stop, using language described as racially charged in the internal report. Investigators also discovered that Peterson had a pattern of targeting vehicles in predominantly black neighborhoods while ignoring similar infractions in white areas. Data analysis showed this. The pattern was clear and documented. Most critically, investigators found that Peterson had not just falsified the details of his encounter with Mitchell, he had falsified arrest reports in other cases too. At least 3 other cases involving black drivers showed similar patterns of escalation and documented lies. The consequences came swiftly. The city of Riverside faced multiple lawsuits. The first was from David Mitchell directly, alleging false arrest, violation of civil rights, and abuse of power. The settlement was $2.1 million, a stunning amount for a city of that size, a message being sent through the only language institutional power sometimes understands: money. But the more damaging consequence for Peterson came through his own department. Criminal charges were filed, perjury in official proceedings, filing false reports, and civil rights violations. Peterson was arrested. His badge was taken. His gun was taken. He was placed on paid suspension pending trial. The Police Benevolent Association initially defended him, but as more evidence emerged, their commitment wavered.
Peterson's own colleagues began to distance themselves. Officers don't like having a liar in their ranks, not because they're morally outraged, but because a liar threatens the credibility of all of them. The department initiated termination proceedings. Despite the union contract that typically protects officers, the case against Peterson was so overwhelming that even those protections failed him. His lawyer negotiated, seeking a deal that might preserve some pension benefits, but the city stood firm. The internal charges included lying on reports, violation of departmental conduct standards, and most significantly, what the department called conduct unbecoming an officer in a manner that undermines public trust. Peterson resigned, not fired technically. He resigned to avoid the formal termination that would have ended his pension entirely, that the distinction was meaningless. His career was over. Here's where the story gets complicated, because American justice is always complicated. Peterson wasn't convicted of the criminal charges in court. The case went to trial, and the jury deadlocked. Some jurors apparently believed Peterson's testimony. Others found his account implausible. Under the legal system's protection, Peterson walked free of criminal consequences. But by then, it didn't matter. His professional life had already ended. No police department would hire him. The story had defined him permanently. His name would forever be associated with this case. David Mitchell's charges were dismissed without prejudice. He filed a civil suit against the city, which settled for the $2.1 million I mentioned. He also pursued a lawsuit against Peterson personally, though Peterson's financial resources limited what Mitchell could actually recover there. The Riverside Police Department was forced to implement new training requirements, body cam policies, and accountability measures. It wasn't revolutionary reform, but it was change. Change that might prevent the next David Mitchell from experiencing what he experienced. The state attorney general cited this case in pushing for statewide police accountability reforms. It became a reference point in conversations about how the system sometimes works, not the way it should work, but the way it occasionally does when you have documentation, resources, and credibility. Here's the uncomfortable truth this case reveals. Accountability in policing usually requires things most people don't have. You need to be educated enough to know your rights, you need to have a camera recording, you need to have the financial resources to pursue legal action, you need to have credibility within the system that's investigating you, you need to have connections to media, you need to have time. David Mitchell had all of these things. That's the only reason Peterson's career ended. Thousands of traffic stops happen every day in America that follow similar patterns. Most don't have body cam footage. Most don't have witnesses. Most victims don't have lawyers. Most don't have the resources or credibility to fight back. So what the story really is about isn't just one officer's downfall. It's about how systemic change usually requires perfect circumstances because the system is designed to protect itself. But it also shows that those circumstances can happen. That accountability is possible, that when the evidence is overwhelming and the pressure is sufficient, even the system's protective mechanisms can fail in favor of justice. The question isn't just what happened to Officer Peterson. The question is, how do we create a system where what happened to Peterson, accountability and consequences, is the norm rather than the exception? David Mitchell is still practicing civil rights law. He took the settlement from his lawsuit against the city and used it to establish a legal fund for people who can't afford representation after police misconduct. He's trained to see patterns other people miss, patterns in the data, patterns in the system. Officer Peterson is no longer in law enforcement. What he's doing now is largely unknown. The system, even when it's removed someone from power, rarely follows that person's trajectory afterward. And perhaps that's appropriate. The point wasn't to destroy Peterson as a human being. The point was to remove him from a position where he could abuse that power. Whether that was justice or simply a system functioning as it occasionally, just occasionally should function, is a question worth sitting with.
But the story doesn't end there. Not really. Because what happened after Peterson's resignation tells us even more about how power works in America and how rarely it actually changes. Within 2 months of Peterson's resignation, the Riverside Police Department quietly rehired 2 other officers who had been fired for misconduct in previous years. Their cases hadn't received media attention, nobody was watching. The department got them back without fanfare,
and the public barely noticed. It's a pattern that happens across the country. An officer gets caught, faces consequences, then quietly moves to another jurisdiction or gets reinstated through legal loopholes. The system protects its own, even when it occasionally seems like it doesn't. The civil rights community watched Peterson's case closely. Legal advocates saw it as a rare victory, but also as a cautionary tale. A victory that only happened because every single element aligned perfectly. Because Mitchell was educated, credible, documented, connected, and wealthy enough to fight. Most victims of police misconduct don't have even one of those things. 6 months after Peterson's resignation, the Riverside Police Department released their report on departmental reforms. The changes looked good on paper. Enhanced body cam policies, implicit bias training, a new civilian review board with actual investigative power. But here's what didn't change. The qualified immunity doctrine still protected officers in most cases. The police union contract still made it nearly impossible to fire officers except in the most egregious circumstances. And the funding for these programs was marginal, with no guarantee of long-term commitment. A year later, a local news outlet did a follow-up investigation. They found that the Civilian Review Board had received 23 complaints against Riverside officers in its first year of operation. Of those 23 complaints, only 4 were deemed to have merit, and only 1 resulted in any actual disciplinary action. The system had reformed itself just enough to look reformed while fundamentally remaining the same. David Mitchell continued his work. The legal fund he established with his settlement money had helped 17 people by the end of the first year. 17 people who might otherwise have had no recourse. 17 people whose stories might have remained invisible. But 17 people against thousands. The math is bleak. Mitchell knew this. He also knew that visibility matters, that precedent matters, that when one case gets through, it opens doors for the next one. He gave a speech at a law school 2 years after the incident. He talked about what happened to him, but more importantly, he talked about what almost happened to him. I got lucky. That's what people don't understand. I got lucky. I was educated, I had a camera, I had documentation, I had credibility, I had money to fight, I had connections to media, I had time. I had all of these things. Do you know what the odds are that any one person has all of these things, let alone all of them at once? He paused. That's the real injustice. Not just what Officer Peterson did, it's that he could only be held accountable by someone like me, someone with all the advantages. The system works only for the privileged, and that's not a system. That's a protection racket. The speech went viral on social media. It was shared by civil rights organizations, lawyers, activists, and ordinary people who recognized the truth in what he was saying. But virality doesn't equal change. Shared videos don't equal policy reform. It felt like progress, but progress and performance are different things. 3 years after the stop, a researcher from a nearby university conducted a comprehensive study of police stops in Ohio. The study looked at data from over 50,000 traffic stops across multiple police departments. The findings were unsurprising to anyone who pays attention. Black drivers were stopped at rates 1.7 times higher than white drivers. They were searched at rates 2.4 times higher. They were arrested at rates 1.9 times higher. The disparities persisted regardless of the type of violation or the neighborhood. The data was clear. The problem was systemic. The stop of David Mitchell wasn't an anomaly, it was the norm. Officer Peterson's name appeared in news stories about this study, not as a person anymore, but as a symbol of a broken system, a symbol of one of the rare moments when accountability happened. But mostly Peterson had faded into obscurity. He wasn't famous anymore. He was just a cautionary tale. But there's another side to this story that people don't talk about as much: the psychological toll on Peterson himself. Whether you believe his version of events or Mitchell's, whether you think he's a racist or just a man caught in a broken system, Peterson's life was destroyed. His career ended, his reputation eviscerated, his name forever attached to this incident. Some people would argue that's justice. Others would say it's a warning about what happens when the system decides you're the scapegoat. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Peterson moved out of state. He avoided the spotlight. He didn't give interviews. He didn't write a book. He didn't try to rehabilitate his image through media. He simply disappeared. Which is what the system does when it's done with someone. It destroys them and moves on. Meanwhile, the broader conversation about police accountability has continued. The Riverside case has been cited in legislative hearings. It's been used as an example in training programs. It's been invoked in arguments about qualified immunity and police reform. One case, one moment, one traffic stop on a Tuesday afternoon has rippled outward, influencing discussions about how power works and how accountability should work. But here's what we need to understand about that ripple. It only happened because of a perfect storm, because of David Mitchell's privilege, his education, his resources, his credibility. If Officer Peterson had pulled over a different black man that day, if that man didn't have a lawyer, if he didn't have a camera, if he didn't have documentation, if he didn't have connections to media, if he didn't have money to fight, then Peterson would probably still be a decorated sergeant at the Riverside Police Department. He'd probably still be pulling people over in black neighborhoods. He'd probably still have that badge and that gun and that power. That's the real story here. Not that one officer was held accountable, but that one officer could only be held accountable under extremely specific circumstances. That accountability in America isn't about justice being blind. It's about power, resources, documentation, and privilege. 5 years after the stop, David Mitchell published a book about his experience. It became a bestseller in certain circles. Civil rights organizations recommended it, law schools assigned it, but mainstream America barely noticed. The book didn't become a household name. Mitchell didn't become a household name. The story faded, as most stories do, replaced by newer outrages, newer injustices, a never-ending cycle of incidents that capture attention for a moment before disappearing. But Mitchell continued the work anyway. The legal fund still operates, the cases still get defended, the patterns still get documented, and every once in a while, when the circumstances align perfectly, accountability happens. The question we have to sit with is this: is that enough? Is occasional accountability, accountability for the privileged few, enough? Or do we need something more fundamental? Do we need to restructure how power works in policing? Do we need to change qualified immunity? Do we need to fund public defenders at the level they deserve? Do we need to end the police union contracts that protect officer misconduct? Do we need to fundamentally reimagine what policing looks like in America? These are questions that Officer Peterson's downfall didn't answer, but it raised them, and sometimes that's all a story like this can do. It can raise the questions. It can make people aware. It can create space for conversations about what could be different, what should be different, what needs to be different. David Mitchell still practices law. He still takes cases. He still fights against police misconduct. He's changed his approach slightly, becoming more strategic about which cases he takes, which ones have the best chance of setting precedent, which ones might create momentum for larger systemic change. He's learned that one person fighting one case at a time isn't enough. But he's also learned that those one cases, when they're visible, when they're dramatic, when they involve the right person and the right evidence and the right moment, they can matter. They can shift something, just slightly, just a little bit, but they can shift it. Officer Peterson never returned to law enforcement. He never worked in security. He essentially disappeared from public life. Whether he reformed his thinking about race and power, whether he came to understand what he did, whether he feels remorse or bitterness or nothing, we don't know. The system removed him, but it didn't transform him. And that's important to understand. Accountability doesn't necessarily equal redemption. It doesn't necessarily equal learning. It just equals consequences. Sometimes that's the best we can hope for. Thank you for watching. If you found this story important, please share it. Support the organizations working on police accountability and civil rights.
Demand that your representatives take this seriously. Demand reform. Demand systemic change, not just individual accountability. Because that's what separates a good story from actual justice. That's what separates one man's downfall from a system transformed. This has been your host. I'll see you in the next one.